All right. Hi, everyone, online and in the room. Robin Lynch and I, Kathleen Ditzig, are pleased to present the second event of offshoreart.co, a curatorial research platform that thinks through offshore economies as a way of understanding global infrastructures and narratives that support them. Today's discussion group, incorporating offshore, the stakes of going offshore for art, engages with the relationship and interests that art has with the offshore. We'll talk about art practices that have taken up the offshore as content, research, and model value creating systems, as well as the reason why more individuals, art trusts, foundations, and organizations are going offshore. Growing from yesterday's discussion on infrastructure, we will question the use of narratives of obscurity and transparency in representing the offshore and how these representations hold up to how the offshore is taken up in the global marketplace, among other things. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our different participants. We have Angus Cameron, the Senior Lecturer in Spatial Organizations at the University of Leicester. His research focuses on the construction of xenospaces, fictional but functional spaces of exteriority, ambiguity, and indeterminacy. Since 2008, he has acted as spokesperson for Swedish performance artist Golden and Senepi on their ongoing project Headless, which, by the way, is doing their first book launch May 13th at Triple Canopy here in New York. He'll be speaking in their place. Mired is an artist that lives and works in Oslo. Her project Surplus is invested in overlaps and incompatibilities between financial and cultural capital. We have Nick Cernicek, who is the author of Inventing the Future, and the author of Post-Capitalist Technologies. He'll speak to the variety of ways in which invisible entities are rendered visible and manipulatable in our age of increased complexity and expanding global finance. And finally, we have Nathan Newman, a New York-based lawyer and trustee of the Bronx Museum. His work has been published in Forbes, Bloomberg, and Politics. To our online audience, each participant will speak for about 15 minutes, after which Darius Suhail Malik will respond and provide our first question to kick off our Q&A. If you have a question for our discussion, please submit your questions through our comment box on our website or through our Facebook event page. Those are going to be the main ways that you can get involved in the conversation. And so with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Angus. So Angus, on to you. Oh, Angus, sorry. Give us, oh, there we go, perfect. Your sound's perfect now. We just lost you for 2 seconds. All right, you're good. Good to go.
All right, good to go. Right, many thanks for that. As Kathleen mentioned, Headless as a project has been running since, well, she mentioned I've been involved since 2008. In fact, the project started in 2007, and it has as its starting point the discovery, inverted commas perhaps, of a company called Headless Limited, from which the project takes its name, which was incorporated in the Bahamas in 2007. Golden and Senebi came across this company while they were researching offshore, so they claim, and that's where the project starts. Because the project's been running for so long, I'm not going to be able to go into huge detail about every aspect of it. It would simply take too long. So I'm just going to touch briefly, necessarily, on the main themes running through offshore. My involvement in offshore, not in offshore, in Headless, my involvement in Headless, because I'm one of the people who performed the project in multiple different ways, and then to think more generally about what Headless does as a project, how Headless relates to offshore. So to give you some overview of Headless, it involves many hundreds of people, I suppose, over the years, all of whom are in some way or another looking for Headless, this being Headless Limited, the company, and foregrounding the secrecy and privacy that offshore affords to those who use it. But Headless is not just about offshore. One of its starting points is the intertwined relationship between contemporary finance and art. Contemporary art, in many instances, being funded by banking and the bonus culture and hedge funds and all these people wanting to spend their money and invest in cultural capital. And so there's an implied questioning and possibly a critique of that involved in the project. But there are wider questions implicit in that. what, for example, is art, what is money, and what is the relationship between those two peculiar entities which often defy definition. And beyond those, how is any of this organized, represented, and created and or recreated? Because a lot of the focus of Headless is on the creative process and how things come to take the form that they do. Now, as Kathleen mentioned, I've been the spokesperson for the project since 2008. I'm not the first spokesperson to be part of the project, and I'm at various times not the only one, though I have had a fairly consistent role over these years. I'm not the only person involved in the project. They've co-opted all sorts of people to participate in, perform, record, document the project over the years, including filmmakers, documentary makers, journalists, other academics, curators, other artists, designers. All sorts of people have got involved in Headless in one way or another as it has developed. My role as spokesperson, or if I'm feeling pedantic, which is often emissary, because I am sent in their place, is a complex one. It's not a simple one in any way, and the performative aspect of the project hinges partly around my role, but partly around a number of other key people involved in the project, particularly the novelist John Barlow, and as Bill Morrow, I think, mentioned yesterday, and I think Kathleen did too a minute ago, a novelized version, and I use that word loosely, of Headless has just been published and will be launched next week in New York and in LA and in London and various other places. So there's lots of people involved in presenting this. My role as spokesperson is primarily to facilitate what Golden and Seneby themselves call, in quotes, an act of withdrawal from their own project. In other words, they have their name on the project, but they don't appear in any of its public events. Instead, when they're asked to present in a gallery, or they're asked to talk at an event like this, or they're asked to do anything publicly, they will send me, or if I can't do it, another person, but it's often me. And so I've travelled all over the world, being Headless or being Golden Seneby at various venues around the world. And in doing so, what I'm enabling them to do is to mimic the privacy, secrecy, concealment that is often associated with offshore finance. One main reason you participate in offshore finance is not to be seen. That's the whole point. And so I kind of have the role of an agent, or an agency perhaps, who facilitates that secrecy. But my role is more than that, because Headless doesn't directly model offshore, and was never intended to. What it does is it creates an alternative version that looks a bit like offshore, because it mimics the techniques used by offshore. And so my role is extended beyond simply being a kind of passive agent who communicates on their behalf to being an active performer as part of the project too. So I am an academic by profession, and I appear in Headless not just as spokesperson, but also from time to time, however laughable this may be, as expert. So I'm the expert voice on offshore finance, for example, or state space or spatiality, or what I call xenospace in documentary. But I also have performed a series of what I call performance lectures at various venues over the years. And these have played quite a central role in the performance of the project. They're less prominent in the novel, though one of them appears there. And just to give you an example, in May 2010, I delivered a peripatetic lecture walking through a forest near Paris called the Forêt de Marly, which was a very important site, partly for the French monarchy, it's part of the general estate around Versailles, but also for the French philosopher Georges Bataille. And Bataille is a figure who haunts Headless. Bataille set up a secret society in 1937 called Acéphale, which means headless. And one of the notions of Headless, the project, is that Headless Limited, the one that was incorporated in the Bahamas in 2007, is in some way a direct or indirect inheritor or echo of Bataille's earlier secret organization in Paris. In the course of this lecture in the forest, where Bataille himself used to lead his group of really quite strange individuals and various rituals in the forest. I delivered a lecture called The Decapitation of Money, which picked up on the title of an earlier one. And it was an opportunity for me to reflect on the relationship between money, banking, revolution, state formation, capitalism, spatiality, bits of philosophy, and Bataille in this place. And it was necessarily quite a complex reflection on all that to communicate the themes of Headless, both live. We did it live in the forest, but then it was also recorded. And that recording then gets reappropriated back into the project by being incorporated into various sculptural installations. So in that instance, it was edited and incorporated into an installation at the Fondation Teased in Paris, and that installation has been reproduced in a number of different places. So there's quite a complex conversation going on between the artists who are not present, me who is present in a number of different guises, not all of which I control, the art world itself, and of course wider academic debates about banking, finance, and the various institutions that make up banking, finance, and its histories. And I've done several of these over the years, and they've been incorporated in different ways in different installations or events as time has gone on. What all of this, to me anyway, and what this performativity speaks to is not just offshore in the specific sense of specific institutions and firms and practices, but much wider issues about power, organisation, co-creation, and identity. Particularly identity, as a spokesperson, has been a particularly fraught issue. Many people look at me rather sadly as I've lost my marbles for having willingly ceded my personality to these two strange Swedish people. But what we create in doing so is a rather hybrid personality that is neither one nor the other. Clearly their name is on the project, even though they go to great lengths to remove it. So, as I think Bill mentioned yesterday, the author on the novel that's just been published is not Goldman's enemy, nor is it the novelist John Barlow, who may or may not have been involved in writing it, but certainly appears as an author in the novel. My name certainly isn't on it, though some of the words in the book may or may not have been mine. But the authorship is attributed to someone called KD. Now, whoever KD is, I can assure you, was not involved in writing the novel. So the purpose of all this is not just to reflect on Offshore, but to reflect on the displacement of identity and the hybridity of identity in this very complex environment. So what Headless is doing is not trying to create a direct analogue of offshore finance. Why would you want to, even if you could? What it does is to use the techniques of offshore to create a very complex and very fragile institution, which in some ways is real. It comprises real, but in some ways is fictional. Some of the people involved are knowing, real, and have, you know, reasonably secure identities. Others don't know they're involved. There are people co-opted into Headless who have no idea they're involved in it. Some are knowing and distinctly unwilling, indeed hostile. There has been, you know, occasional legal letter fired our way when we strayed over a particular line. But what it creates is this, to borrow a Bataillean phrase, an acephalic organisation. It is a headless organisation. There is no centre. And it's distributed across the world in a way that Bataille, whilst he might not recognise the specific form of headless, would probably recognise the sort of headless organisation he was trying to create in the 30s. Bataille's notion of acéphale was that it would be a secret society that, through a symbolic and possibly physical act of decapitation, would unleash a social energy that would in some way challenge fascism. It didn't actually happen in the end because the war rather overtook things, but that was what he was trying to do. So Headless as a project is very much echoing that desire of Bataille's to unleash these energies and to create this decentered social form. But it's also, again, to bring it back to Offshore and art, one of the things that Headless posits quite strongly is that offshore itself is an art form. Just as Headless is a series of invented relationships and narratives and events, so often is offshore finance. The fact that it's lawyers and accountants that are doing the inventing doesn't make it any less a creation, an artwork. And so, whilst Headless does not try to provide any solutions to this, it's not a political manifesto, it's not a campaigning organisation. What it does is to raise questions around the nature of creativity, and the nature of art, and the nature of finance. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Angus. I'm going to switch now over to Marianne. Marianne, I'm turning your mic up, so give it a second. Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Now everyone can hear you, and I'm going to hand it over to you now, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I will, as you said, I will be talking about Surplus, which is a project I showed at Bergen Kunsthal as a solo show in 2012 for the festival there. I want to share my screen with you. Just see if I can fix that. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So what you see here is the Kunsthal. It's actually a picture of Bergen. And you see the Kunsthal situated right in the middle of the picture. It's the green functionalist building. And Bergen is it's a rich and very pretty and neat and quite bourgeois city in a very wealthy country, which is Norway. And if you look closely, you will see in front of the building there is the installation called Vima, which is something that I will get back to afterwards. That's part of the Surplus project. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind this project. This
Marianne?
the Russian oligarch.
Marianne? Marianne? Sorry guys, I'm gonna have to call back Marianne. I think her connection's a little weak. There we go. Just give it a minute. You know what? We're going to let Marianne restart her presentation shortly. Do you mind, Nick, do you mind taking the lead first and presenting on yours so we don't lose on any time?
Yeah, I can do that. That's no problem.
All right. Here. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to you first, Nick.
Okay. So what I want to do today is to sort of briefly look at some of the ways in which actual practitioners in the financial markets have used tools to visualize global finance. And I want to do this in order to counter the tendency I see towards the technical sublime, which seems quite prominent in the art world today when it tries to represent global finance. And I think too often a critical aesthetics of finance tends towards a glorification of complexity for its own sake. It can be quite good at producing a sort of technical sublime, so something which leaves the viewer in a sort of awe-inspiring state and an overwhelmed state with the massive information thrown at it. But it also leaves the viewer in cognitive disarray, and I don't think it generates any political impulse beyond a sort of abstract negation of that complexity. So I think by looking at the practices of financial traders themselves, We can learn some insights into how financial markets are represented and manipulated in ways which are both highly aesthetic, but also intimately pragmatic as well. Now, this isn't to say that I think artists should just become computer modelers, but I think it does show that financial complexity can be aesthetically represented in ways which aren't simply cognitively intractable and pragmatically overwhelming. And I think it shows that we can create an interface between finite human minds and complex global systems in such a way that we do have some ability to manipulate the latter. And I think the task for art, as Suhail Malik has pointed out to me, would then be to traverse the gap between the pragmatic and the critical. So to avoid both the extremes of the technical sublime on one hand, and on the other hand, a sort of empty data visualization that simply consolidates existing understandings of the market. So what do I mean when I say that the global financial markets are complex? Well, I think they're complex in both a technical sense of a complex system, but also in an intuitive sense about complexity. So in the sort of mundane, everyday sense, markets are comprised of tens of thousands of traders carrying out billions of transactions every day. And with the recent incorporation of algorithmic trading, these volumes are surging ahead. So I think in the past 5 years, it's been something like an 800% increase in the volumes being traded. And this surge in volume has been matched by a surge in the variety of financial products available as well. So traditional equities and bonds were joined first by sort of simple derivatives, and now you have increasingly exotic derivatives and increasingly abstract products. So things like the volatility of volatility is being traded in markets. Now, in response to this expansion of products, volumes, and market participants, a variety of tactics have been developed to simplify this complexity. So if you look at, say, any particular organization involved in the financial markets, they've set up trading desks devoted to specific securities, specific regions, and traders make use of a variety of heuristics in an attempt to make sense of the mass of information. So we can think here of profit earnings ratios, the cost of a credit default swap, bond spreads, these sorts of things being used as heuristics. So this is one sense of complexity, but in another sense, global financial markets are also complex systems in the very technical sense of that. So they're subject to critical phase transitions, sensitivity to initial conditions, they're self-organizing, and they're capable of generating emergent phenomenon. And price variations in markets tend to follow a random walk pattern, but under certain conditions they produce significant critical events, which is to say they produce crashes that can be modeled as a phase transition in the market. And various patterns in the financial markets all suggest that their nature is a properly complex system. So I think it's because of these sorts of complexities that financial actors have turned towards the various representational technologies in order to intervene in the market. So the use of tools and technologies to both understand and visualize the market and then to act and intervene in it. And I think we often forget, because we've naturalized this idea of the market, but there is actually no empirical referent for such a term. So no one has ever seen a global financial market in the flesh. And such an entity exists only in and through local situations and constructed perspectives. And I think the history of financial markets has simultaneously been the history of the techniques used to visualize and sort of make present the global financial market. And one of the first such perceptions was created through the medium of price charts in the 1830s. So these charts abstracted away from the particularities of companies, and they made clear the patterns of stocks that comprised a market. So by composing them in chart form, these patterns made perceptible something like the market as a whole. So in the words of one broker at the time, the chart provided the bird's eye view of the stock market. Now these charts, in other words, constructed what Bruno Latour has called a panorama, which is to say a local overarching view of a global totality which obscures its own production and mediation. So it takes on a sort of natural quality as though we're immediately seeing the global. Now, it was at this point, however, these sort of initial representations, they were still largely static. Now, the visualization of the market took on sort of temporal qualities with the introduction of the stock ticker in the 1870s. So this technology came to replace the discontinuous publicizing of prices that had previously occurred. Before the ticker, prices had been plagued by variation in the quotes. So errors were rampant. There was a lot of discontinuity between different brokers and different stock prices. Now, with the advent of the stock ticker, instead of multiple discontinuous, heterogeneous, and unsystematically recorded prices, you now have a single continuous, homogeneous, and nearly a real-time price variation. So in other words, I think we start to approximate a representation of the market which increasingly feels real and lifelike, and has a certain dynamism to it as well, even as the technical mediations behind it grow increasingly significant. Now today this has exploded into the tendency for modern markets to be represented entirely by on and through screens, and away from floor-based exchanges to entirely screen-based trading. So as one author commenting on foreign exchange markets puts it, most FX trading takes place through the medium of the screen and electronic booking systems. Most information also comes through the screen, through proprietary services, things like Bloomberg, or through email and bulletin boards to which all the traders on the floor can contribute, and through telephone conversations on open lines with company dealers in other locations. Now the same goes for day traders as well, where ethnographic research suggests the vast majority of their time is spent simply on price observation. And the actual acts of trading are themselves a relatively small portion of their day. So much of the modern trading environment is constituted in and through computer representations. And I think this is significant because if we want to know how the markets are framed and visualized, it means that we have to look at the models and the computer software which produce the frame, which produce this very representation of the market. And as with any frame, each one obscures certain aspects while bringing other aspects to light. And so I think at a fundamental level, therefore, today's global financial markets are materially produced as an object of cognition via the mediation of databases, computer programming algorithms, and data visualization tools. So such technology standardizes and normalizes the representation of the market. And it takes on, again, an increasingly sort of substantial reality despite being produced through these sort of local instantiations. And through this, these representations come to construct a sort of community as well. They produce both a common language and a common perception of the market and its relevant factors. So it allows economic actors to rationalize their future courses of action and to project the outcomes of these actions. And it's a process which establishes boundaries between efficient and inefficient actions. So now I want to turn to one particular market and one particular model to look at the sort of way in which the market is understood and visualized here. In particular, this is derivatives markets and derivative pricing models. So with these models, one of the most unique aspects of this material construction has been the language of volatility that has come to dominate in practice. Now, to understand volatility, we need to understand a little bit about derivatives pricing models. And I'll try not to get into too much technical detail here. The first one of these models was Black-Scholes-Merton model, or BSM. And the essential contribution of this model was that it enabled a consistent and rational price to be given to options. So before this model came about, the problem with pricing options was that it was difficult to estimate how prices might change in the future, and therefore how much the option might be worth today. So beforehand, a sort of a set of heuristics had been developed, and sort of shorthands had been built up in order to give some consistency to the pricing between different options. But the ad hoc nature of it all meant that options were unlikely to ever become a sort of a major market like they have in the past 40 years. Now with Black-Scholes-Merton, there's a new consistency between different options and emerges a sort of rational market for options comes about. Now significantly, the equation used here largely relied upon observable data that could be sort of easily slotted in to the model. It only relied upon one unobservable variable, which was volatility, which becomes an important part of the story. And it was given a number, volatility was given a number, premised upon a seemingly reasonable assumption about the random nature of price movements. And for a couple of decades, this approach worked pretty well in practice. Options followed the prices theorized by the model, and in fact, Don McKenzie has shown that they even converged towards the model's price. So the model was actually shaping reality at this point. It wasn't just representing the market, but actually constructing it as well. Now, with the crash of 1987, the sort of relationship between the model and the prices breaks down, and options start to systematically, which is to say not randomly, but systematically diverge from what the model suggested that they should be. And the basic reason why this occurred appears to be that traders were starting to price in the possibility of statistically unlikely events. So chastened by the crash, traders recognized that these black swan events were much more likely than, to occur than the assumptions in the models sort of assumed. So this meant that options which could be affected by these sorts of events were increasingly priced higher than they should be, at least according to the model. Now, it's sort of interesting here because what happens in practice is a sort of inversion of the model. So despite these models mispricing the options, traders didn't stop using the models. Instead, they used them in a different way. So rather than use the equations to solve for the price of the option, they began to use the equation to solve for the implied volatility given by the market prices. So if you remember, the equation had one unobservable variable, which was volatility. So instead of solving the equation for price, you now solve for volatility, and you put market prices into the equation and into the model. I think it's worth mentioning here as well, though, even market prices are themselves mediated by computational processes. So there's no such thing as sort of raw data within the markets. So now the reasons for this sort of inversion from using the models to generate price to using the models to figure out implied volatility, the reasons for this shift were twofold. Now first, since the volatility variable was unobservable, traders used the market prices for liquid options to generate the appropriate volatility for the option pricing model. So they could then input this derived constant back into the equation and extrapolate from sort of observable variables in order to price things which were unobservable. So it enabled them to sort of get a hold on the market in ways that were completely impossible without this tool. Now the second reason for the shift was the conceptual simplification that volatility brought about. So as a sort of theoretically produced entity, volatility managed to act as a common denominator behind the multiplicity of derivatives, strikes, maturities, and sectors. So quoting derivatives in terms of volatility rather than price allowed traders to quickly determine whether a derivative is misvalued and how it could be used to hedge their own position. So volatility very rapidly became the language of options traders. I think it's sort of interesting here to bring this back a little bit to Marx. So money in Marx is conceptualized as a general equivalent that manages to bring together otherwise heterogeneous commodities. But I think with implied volatility, we actually find an even more abstract general equivalent. So for derivatives traders, price is actually still too relative to time in terms of maturity for an option, and possibility in terms of strike price for an option. So price is still varied based upon these sorts of things. But what was needed was an abstract equivalent that could make comparisons between price, time, and possibility. And implied volatility came to serve this purpose. So I think there's a sort of interesting abstraction away from the abstraction of money going on here. Now the significance of this is that the repurposing of the BSM model, it was no longer a simple tool to construct a price, but instead a representational technology to basically take the massive amount of information that traders had thrown into and to sort out and filter out the irrelevant information in order to infer the market's collective expectation of future volatility. So how is the market likely to change the next 10 days, the next 10 years? So this use of options pricing models to perceive an aspect of market prices that is otherwise imperceptible is now a standard practice. So options and derivatives are routinely quoted in terms of their volatility. There's even an entire index called the VIX, which has arisen in order to trade volatility. And you sort of get options upon derivatives and derivatives. It becomes quite abstract very rapidly. So while BSM and other derivative pricing models have lost some of their uncritical acceptance, the terms that they introduced into the derivatives world have remained fundamental. And the ability to see volatility is now a reality for traders. And this is in the same way that the smallest particles of the world can only be visualized through specialized instruments. And it's the same way volatility is only perceivable through the use of specialized financial models. And I mean this quite literally. Volatility is something which is readily visualizable. And there's a massive, market for options pricing software, which basically just generates visualizations of the market. So they typically take the form of three-dimensional figures, which plot out the strike price and maturity dates and prices of an option, and which enable, through this visualization, a rapid sort of ability to understand how you can intervene, how the market is changing, what to do in order to make a profit. And so there's an array of different ways of visualizing it, volatility. But I think what you see here is an attempt to grapple with the complexity and the obscurity of a global financial market, but to do so in a way which enables action rather than negates it. So just to sort of conclude, I think two important sort of lessons, or two sort of questions that could be raised for a critical aesthetics of global finance is, what would a critical aesthetics of global finance be that would enable action? And what sort of art could generate a political impulse beyond just an abstract negation of overwhelming complexity? So what does it mean in order to build art that facilitates action rather than shuts it down with overwhelming complexity? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We're still having issues getting Marianne online, so what we're going to do is go straight to you, Nathan, and then when you're done, we'll have to maybe restart the call and just bring her back online. All right, on to you, Nathan. Give me 2 seconds to deal with your volume.
When you're ready.
All right, and we're good. We can hand over to you now. Thanks, Nathan.
Okay, so I'm on. You can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
All right, good. So let me start by talking about how I understand offshore and what that word indicates and what it means. Offshore is all about boundaries, and the boundaries are defined by rules, by jurisdiction. So, for example, Hawaii is not offshore because the essential rules that we might be talking about are the same as they are in other parts of the country. Puerto Rico is a hybrid offshore, not offshore, because some of the rules apply and some of them don't. And then, Cayman Islands or another non-U.S. country, that's an offshore jurisdiction. And it's really about the fact that a different set of rules applies there than the ones that apply onshore. In our case, onshore is the U.S. So I'm fascinated by this interest in offshore as a place in our culture and in our collective imaginations and what it represents to be outside of boundaries that we're normally having to deal with, and how that the difference in the rules that apply here and the rules that apply there lead to situations and become a resource for achieving certain aims in the cases of some people. So what Angus calls xenospaces, and this idea of creating a space that's other, that's outside of our normal space, and where there is the opportunity of secrecy or at least some obscurity and displacement of entity. These are, I think there's a lot of rich resources to mine when we start when we're discussing art and the collective imagination that art taps into. But if that is like soaring through the heavens, then I'm like the airplane mechanic that makes sure that the jet engine works. And so the core function that I play professionally in that world is highly technical, and it may not ultimately be so interesting. But I want to mention that because earlier I think Angus also mentioned that this isn't about financial. This discussion isn't about financial planning and techniques that might avail someone of certain benefits by going offshore as opposed to staying onshore, because that's sort of a discussion I think necessarily has different priorities and speaks to different interests. In that sort of discussion is all about, not getting thrown in jail by the IRS and availing oneself of opportunities that exist. But given that we are exploring this area of otherness, of outside the boundaries that we normally live in and where we normally abide by the rules, there have been some recent developments that are very significant in the legal landscape that I'm just going to describe briefly, not because I think it's important for the people who are interested in the topics that we're discussing to understand the legal aspects of this, but because I think it adds to the reality, the situation that we're discussing here. So back to the idea of offshore being defined by jurisdictional boundaries. When it comes to financial assets, the onshore-offshore differentiation comes down to this: you're a U.S. person, you're a U.S. citizen, you live in the U.S., you own some financial assets. You have those. You hold those assets at a U.S. bank, a U.S. institution. Those are onshore. If you hold assets at a non-U.S. institution in a non-U.S. country, say the Cayman Islands, then you're holding those assets offshore. So one of the differences that people have discovered between having assets onshore and offshore is that if you hold those assets onshore, the U.S. institution where you hold them is going to report their existence to the Internal Revenue Service. And at the end of the year, or on April 15th, when you're filing your tax return, you are meant to also report the existence of those assets. And the IRS compares those two reports, and that's one of the ways that the IRS keeps people honest. If you know that your U.S. bank accounts are going to be reported to the IRS, you don't try to conceal them when it's your turn to file your tax return. Conversely, if you're holding these assets offshore, traditionally what has happened is that there is no reporting by the non-U.S. institution directly to the IRS, and people have seen that as an opportunity to also not report it when they are filing their tax return, and then not have to pay taxes on income that they've earned in this offshore location. So this has been a situation for many years, and the famous offshore locations are known to all of us: Switzerland and the Cayman Islands and some of the Channel Islands in Europe. And for many years, not only the U.S. but other countries have made attempts to try to shut down that opportunity to basically to cheat on your taxes, and for decades those attempts never went anywhere. But in 2010, the U.S. passed a law called FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, and it's significant because it's really one of the most robust uses of American power imperialistically that we've seen when it comes to norms, to normative imperialism, to imposing rules, your own rules on the rest of the world. It may be the biggest use of power by the U.S. government that we've seen. Basically, what the U.S. government declared was that after a phase-in period, non-U.S. financial institutions were going to be required to report directly to the IRS precisely the same, or very much the same way that U.S. institutions have always had to do it. So here you have the U.S. government dictating to non-U.S. institutions that are outside of the jurisdiction of the U.S. and therefore offshore in the way that we're defining it, that they have to report to the IRS as if the IRS did exercise jurisdiction over the institutions. And the way that the IRS managed to enforce this is by imposing draconian penalties on any financial institution that refused to participate, to go along. And the penalties are enforceable because of the hegemony of the US dollar. So there's practically no financial institution in the world that doesn't have interactions in US dollars. And any of those interactions is within the reach of the US Treasury, the IRS. And so it's subject to being to a fine. So suddenly institutions the world over were faced with having to comply with IRS diktats, with IRS regulations, and really an infringement of sovereignty. The IRS is going out and requiring institutions worldwide to respond to it. In many cases, these new requirements violated local privacy laws because, just as we have in this country, laws that protect account holders' privacy, they exist almost everywhere. So if a bank in, say, the Cayman Islands, which is now faced with this ruinous fine if they don't report account holder information to the IRS, is also bound by a local law that prohibits them from sharing account holder information with third parties, including a foreign government. So what ended up happening is that foreign governments entered side agreements with the U.S. whereby they basically caved. They revised their local laws to permit these institutions to report directly to the IRS. So there's a lot of complications in this new worldwide regime that's being implemented now. But the effect of it is to shut down an area of secrecy that has existed in these offshore locations, so that the sort of obscurity and secrecy that has traditionally existed when it comes to financial products held in offshore accounts is a thing of the past, and it's becoming a worldwide phenomenon. So it's in the future. It's not only going to be non-U.S. banks reporting to the U.S. government, but we're moving towards full reciprocity, where there's going to be transparency of account information for purposes of taxation worldwide. This new regime affects only financial accounts. So in the world of art, there is actually a practical consequence to all of this that's different now than it has been. Whereas it will now be practically impossible to hold financial assets offshore and have them benefit from some obscurity or secrecy. The same is not true for personal property, including artwork. So a U.S. person who has an Andy Warhol at a safety deposit box in the Cayman Islands, even if that safety deposit box is within a financial institution, that does not get reported directly to the IRS. So here we now have this pocket of difference between the type of in this case, the Andy Warhol we're speaking of it as an asset, as something that is owned as personal property. Suddenly, that asset is fundamentally different in the way that it's being treated than a financial asset. So that's the new world order that we're living with now, and that's being constructed and implemented. And there are planning opportunities and legal consequences, but there's also this conceptually there's also this now idea that that holdings of artwork spread around the world continue to occupy, I think, what Angus called as xenospace, whereas financial assets are suddenly going to be treated differently, and the fundamental difference is that their existence is no longer it no longer complies with the definition of offshore as we've understood it, because again, offshore is all about jurisdiction, about what certain rules apply here, different rules apply somewhere else, and now the same rules are going to be applying wherever you go. In that respect, when it comes to holding financial assets, holding a financial asset in the Cayman Islands is not gonna occupy a space that is fundamentally different from holding that same asset in onshore at a U.S. institution. So that's the recent developments in the law of onshore versus offshore, and interesting to think about how it operates in the more sort of collective imagination of what it has meant to be offshore versus onshore.
Thank you, Nathan. That was really interesting to find out these new developments. And actually, it's a good segue to talk about a work that talks about two different types of capital. We have Marianne back. So I am going to switch over to you now, Marianne. Give me 2 seconds to make sure your sound's good. All right. Can you hear it? Can you say something, Marianne? Okay. I need to unmute. Can you try unmuting yourself, Marianne?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Now we can hear you. That's great.
So sorry, I don't know what happened.
It's fine. Don't worry about it.
I'll just go back to sharing the screen then. I'm hoping. Are you still there? Can you still hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
So I was talking about this image that was kind of an inspiration to me. It shows the mega luxury yacht of Roman Abramovich, and I'm sure you know who he is, but he's a Russian oligarch. It's placed just outside of the main entrance of the Venice Biennale, and the image is from 2011, and of course it was published all over the world. It was also kind of creating an outcry in Venice because this had never happened before. You know, you have this private yacht blocking not only the visuals towards the laguna, but you also have things on board where, apart from Abramovich himself and his girlfriend Daria Zhukova, who is also a curator / collector, there were people such as Courtney Love and Elton John, etc. So there was a lot of celebrity on board, and that called for special security measures. So you can see that the whole entrance is practically blocked by these fences, keeping the general audience out. I found this image a bit, of course, alarming and very significant. I'm not going to be naive. The Venice Biennial is not an idealistic or democratic institution. Of course, there are all kinds of even quite cynical and commercial mechanisms behind the selection of the works on show in the Biennale, but it's not a fair, and it's not meant to be commercial. Although, of course, you can see the effects of what is presented there almost immediately afterwards in Basel at the fair there, if you go on in that direction. But it's supposed to be a place showing art for art's own sake, and potentially also a venue for, you know, uncompromising critical and experimental art. And especially it's supposed to be a place where you can present works that don't translate well as goods on the market. And it's also the world's oldest biennale, so it's kind of an important significant place. It means, you know, that place means art for art's sake. So if there is nothing on sale there, and Abramovich has no other role than that of being part of the audience, what is he doing there? Of course he is there because of his extreme financial power. And this image, what it says is really like everything is for sale if the offer is high enough, and everything is available for the rich, of course, and there is no such thing as not commercial, which to me as an artist was very shocking, really. Because this image to me illustrates how something very powerful is pushing from the outside of the art institution, and these are extreme forces for whom all objects are to be intended as goods, all gestures as services, and each individual, we, I mean us, everyone, are to be considered either as consumers or producers. There's like nothing in between. And this creates a scenario where everything is described in terms of finance and market logic, making it compatible with and controllable by financial capitalism. And I just feel that is somehow at odds with how art has always worked. So this is the installation Vima, and here this pressure is symbolized by this massive pile of ship remains forming a huge sculpture just placed immediately outside the main entrance of the art institution. And at this time, Bergen Kunsthall was arguably the most important exhibition venue in Norway. At the time, its director was Solveig Øvstebø, who is now at the Renaissance Society in Chicago, so you probably have heard of her. And they ran this bold and uncompromising but very successful program, which kind of set the agenda for the region. These ship remains come from a trawler which was built in 1977 and at first was registered with Bergen as its home port. So this is not a luxury yacht at all, it is an industrial vessel. This image is from 2005 and it was the first time I saw Vima. It's in the so-called Russian harbor in Kirkenes, which is one of the northernmost cities in Norway. And Vima is the one with the high black tower. This is the oldest picture I have found of the ship, and I think it was almost practically new here from building. And at first it was called Meløyvær, and you see it's well, it's in good shape here. And here it is also still in good shape. It's fishing. It's still called Meløyvær, but as you can see, they have changed the tower to make place for more contemporary technology. And here it is in Tromsø, in the docks for maintenance, and I think this dates at some time around 2002. And by now it has changed name from Meløyvær to Tevik to Osvaldsson to Tromsbas and finally to Vima. And each of these shifts signs a change in ownership connected to the ship. So actually tracing all these shifts has been a massive work for me. The thing is also that by each sail and each shift, the ship seems also to drop financially in value. In 2001, Vima is removed from the register of shipping in Norway, and the new owners are Russians, so that's why you can see by now the name is written in Cyrillic letters. It's just painted over the old Latin letters that were embossed underneath. And it's registered in British Virgin Islands. It keeps the name, as you can see, and it fishes for a while in the Pacific before being registered in Murmansk. And in 2005, that's the year when I saw it first, it was put under arrest in Kirkenes, and that was not because of it wasn't doing illegal fishing, but it was because the owners were not paying their debts. So the ship started accumulating daily fees, and it also kept shifting owners several times, so on the other side of the Russian border. So at this time, the ship is still seaworthy, but it's in need of reparations. And finally then, in 2007, it is removed also from the Russian Maritime Register. So by then it had no clear status anymore. In fact, it's turned into some kind of ghost. And here you see it as a ghost. This is the image from 2011, and Vima is here being tugged south to the breakers yard in Trondheim, which is further south. And now it's considered a threat to the environment, and that's because it's rusting and there is a possibility of leakage of chemical stuff on board. And at this time, the ship owes much more than its own worth in various kinds of debts and fees and everything. So that's when I came into the picture, because by now the whole ship is sold as scrap metal at the breakers yard, and I bought it for 3.50 kroner a kilo, which translates to, I think, 0.45 US dollars. So I just selected the pieces that I wanted for the installation and bought it by the kilo. So I think here you see the cutting of the ship, the pieces that I selected. So to me, the story of Vima just shows how this economic logic can mean that a trawler is not seaworthy, while the ship itself could have been repaired for further use. So it's like all value has gradually been sucked out of it. There was just no way to save it anymore by the end. But to me, it is still, and I know this might sound naive, but it is absurd that the material is still there, the ship is still there. It's just the way we describe it that has changed, and by consequence, the material has changed. So it's not the other way around. I don't know if that makes sense. So this is Vima outside. This is taken from the rooftop of the Kunsthal. So you see how it was placed. It is a very neat place, Bergen. It's a rich, very rich and bourgeois city. So of course Vima caused an outcry because it was so ugly. So yeah, people hated it basically. Bergen is, as it is a very rich city, it's kind of groomed and pretty in a way that you don't really see work. You see more consumption than actual production. So this is also a way of showing, you know, the backside of that wealth, which is very visible in Norway. Another thing that happened, which was of a slightly different sign, was that this homeless guy, who was also a flute player, moved into the installation and stayed there during the days for almost all of the exhibition period. And since he was a flute player, he also composed a musical piece which he kept performing all during the whole period. That was very nice, I think. And in the exhibition there was also another work which is called Diamond, and this has to be seen in relation to Vima. These two works were in kind of a dialogue or in tension to each other. During a ceremony, I presented a 1.26 carat diamond as a gift to the Kunsthal, and this diamond was bought with money that I earned from my own work and also from selling my previous artworks to a museum. So to me, this gift represents a symbolic activation of the purpose of the institution, which is to defend art and its fundamental principles. Diamonds, of course, are the hardest natural material on Earth, so it can only be cut by other diamonds. And it also has this unique capacity to reflect light, making it look as though the light is generated by the stone, when in fact it's just a reflection of existing light around it. So I think that's kind of a metaphor or parallel to how art works. And the performance was held on the building's facade facing Vima, and it was nice because the Norwegian Queen was also attending the opening, and she was standing in the middle of all these remains of the ship, and I was on top there. So you see there is this little roof on top of the main entrance, And the performance consisted of a speech describing the role of economics for the understanding and the control of the world as I saw it. Before the diamond, you see, I put it into this kind of, I don't know what it's called in English. It's kind of a box, actually, made out of metal. So it's supposed to be proof, to be safe, so that you can't steal it. And the diamond was handed over to the chief technician, who you see here, and he walled it into the facade, while the singer Guri Egge sang the aria Vissi d'arte from Giacomo Puccini's Tosca. And this aria is precisely about the uncompromising nature of art, about what is not for sale. So the story here goes that the villain of the story has kidnapped La Tosca's lover, and he kind of blackmails her or pushes her into giving herself to him so that he will set her lover free. And this aria is La Tosca's cry of desperation, or it is her resistance towards the villain. She says, I have only ever lived for art, and it's like saying, I'm not for sale. So she resists him. Here is the diamond, almost completely walled. And it's still there, actually. I was very afraid that it would be stolen, but it's still on the facade, so you can see it when you pass in front of it. And I think of this as this presence of this tiny gem as a kind of symbolic but also quite concrete strengthening of the facade to kind of help the institution resist the increasing pressure from outside. So I think all this is a way for me to discuss, I mean, how did this situation happen? How did we get here? To a situation where what used to be public or ours has been privatized through this gradual process that, you know, for me as an ordinary citizen seems like something that I was never asked about. It's something that happened in a kind of technical side room to the democratic discourse. And this is very visible here in social democratic Scandinavia, which of course is the place I am speaking from, but you can also equally see it in the rest of Europe. So you see that the value present in society is concentrated also here on fewer and fewer hands, and circulation, participation, shared ownership, solidarity, co-identification, and these are all values that were kind of central to the whole idea of social democracy. And they're all made increasingly difficult as society has been more and more fragmented to help the growth of the few. So this, of course, is also reflected in the whole condition of art production. So to me, the diamond is not exactly, I mean, it's of course not a solution, but it's a suggestion, as I see it, of a possible position or an attitude, which is of, I mean, it's of absolute resistance. And of course, also trust in art's own unique qualities. And I think I'll stop there. So thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Suhail, who will be our respondent and provide us with the first question before we go to a Q&A. Just for our web audience, we're going to have about 40 minutes for Q&A, so if you have any dying questions that you want to ask any of our participants, you should probably do so soon so that we can ask them those questions. And also, if any of our participants have questions for each other, I would recommend you ask right after Suhail responds. I'll unmute your mics at that point. Okay, Suhail.
All right. Thank you, Kat. I'm going to ask a fairly elaborate question, which is unusual, but partly as a way to kind of summarize and hopefully bring together, because the presentations were quite disparate. I'm going to try and sort of present a kind of way of melding them into giving them a common core, I suppose. And I guess what I'm interested in through the presentations is an extension of the question asked in yesterday's session, which was around how do we see contemporary capitalism, and how do we see contemporary forms of accumulation taking place, and what do we look to in order to see power organized through capital accumulation today. And yesterday was in relationship to the material infrastructures of offshoring, such as undersea cables, the rooms that sort of accommodate the transition from the undersea cable to the cable on land and so on. But what I want to ask about today, as I said, to cut across presentations, is more about the assumptions around obscurity and visualization of capital assets and their generation. Okay? And just to, because it seemed to me that what was being spoken about in Angus's talk and also in Nathan's was what's happening, almost obscurity as a way of kind of holding assets away from jurisdictional powers and so on. But what Nick and Marianne were talking about in a way was the making manifest, or the visualization, it's the transparency of capital. In order to kind of like weave in these different presentations. And again, this might be somewhat repetitious or haphazard because I'm thinking this as I'm going along. So the question is, what does capitalism look like? What do capital assets and their development and accumulation look like? Well, on the one hand, it looks like a yacht, so chewing up a lot of the Venice canal side, but also it looks like the breakdown of industrial shipping in the north. Right, so fishing and so on and so forth, and the uselessness of a trawler or a shipping vehicle of that size against the sort of mega shipping containers and so on. So there's a kind of immediate industrial era. There's an immediate presentation of industrial era wealth generation, and also a presentation of a new kind of neoliberal order through the luxury yacht, which is there for a luxury event, such as the Venice Biennial. But the other thing that capital accumulation looks like is the processes that Nick was talking about, which looks like a bunch of diagrams and necessarily mediated representations of capital flows, and the VIX index related to other kind of derivatives and options markets and so on and so forth. So that's obviously a kind of informatic demonstration of capital. It's not material, and it's about the processes of accumulation. And those processes are volatile, unstable, temporally organized, and not organized through fixed assets, fixed capital in the way that a ship is. Those are two very distinct types of visualization of capital, or kind of materialization, if you want. One is industrial material, the other is a kind of informatic material. And in a way that captures the difference from industrialism to post-industrialism, or Fordism to kind of post-Fordist moment. That sort of coheres. Equally, what we have in Angus's presentation is a way of not quite representing, but indexing how capital should stay obscure if it's to kind of, through the offshoring, if it's going to be protected from regulation, obscurity, through a kind of modernist notion of state transparency and sort of law being an operation across transparent space, civil spaces. Obscurity is a kind of condition for the holding of wealth away from regulation. And what Nathan was describing was the in which that's being transformed as regards capital assets and now becomes located more in the outfield for reasons of what's being taxed and the changing regulatory order. Right? But I think within that broad determination, or kind of, I admit, quite artificial stitching together of these different presentations, what I'm interested in is the order of abstraction that's involved in these. And I wonder as a question whether there's a new order of abstraction that would allow us to kind of cross-section across these presentations. Clearly, the pictures that Marianne was showing us, the yacht and the ship, are fixed capital, forms of fixed capital. and to that extent, material representations of capital accumulation and its growth. The genealogy of information that Nick was speaking about, it requires abstractions of capital generation through production and material processes, and those abstractions themselves become conditions of new types of capital accumulation, those processes. Okay, but what was I think compelling in Nathan's discussion, and in a way connects back to Angus's, is the way in which the offshore is now not necessarily about territories and jurisdictions, but it is about legal spaces, okay, or if you want, xenospaces. But those xenospaces are no longer organized around by sovereignties. So in a way, the offshore goes from being an asset held outside of the jurisdiction of one's own country or reporting authority to being what kind of asset is being held. So if in the unregulated art market, if the art market is obscure to the tax authorities, in whichever regulation, it's the offshore space. Right? So offshoring then moves. I mean, this is a very stylized discussion. I appreciate. I don't have the details. But if the capital asset itself is now the offshore rather than the territory it's held in, for the reasons that Nathan was describing, offshoring is another name for obscurity and transparency anywhere that it happens. So what we then have is a kind of weird, I think, reorganization of abstraction, where on the one hand, the kind of demonstrations of what I think are, from Nathan's account, are now superannuated notions of offshoring, which is to do with obscurity, privacy of places and jurisdictions outside of one's own sort of transparent legal and taxation space. That obscurity of the artwork, and if you want, of the producers of the artwork, isn't a play of offshoring, it's offshoring itself. Right? So the kind of practices exemplified, kind of performed by Golden and Seneby, with the proxies, the avatars, the representatives, and so on, are in fact what offshoring has become for real, rather than a play. I mean, I appreciate that it starts off as a simulacrum of like the BVI as a place which is obscure to Euro-American tax authorities, and then that's kind of presented in a kind of codified form in an exhibition space, or the kind of processes you're talking about. But what was striking in Nathan's discussion today, and in Bill Maur's discussion yesterday, was the way in which those formerly offshore spaces, BVI and Cayman Islands and so on, are now kind of relatively transparent and relatively straightforward. So Bill Maur was talking about how, rather than nesting ownership through any number of organizations and sort of shell companies, Chinese companies now register in the Cayman Islands, register in the BVI. They set up a primary company in the BVI, which then owns a company in the Cayman Islands, which then owns the originating organization in China, in order to take advantage of the equity laws in the BVI, the ability to participate in American stock markets through the Cayman Islands, and then actually do the production stuff or whatever they're doing in China. So in a way, they're pretty relaxed, and there's no need to be at all obscure about the ownership structures, because they're using the transparency of the law which is granted to them by those sovereignties. Equally, for the reasons Nathan was describing, the kind of tax obscurity and taxation, I guess, is now being stripped away. So obscurity now resides in the kind of asset it is, the kind of requirements of asset reporting to tax authorities. And it seems to me that, in fact, that's exactly what's going on in the Golden and Seneby practice. And what strikes me as being paradoxical, and this paradox I'm trying to understand, is as much as the obscurity and, in a way, the willful occlusion of responsibility to reporting authorities in the golden and centipede practice demonstrates offshoring, and in a way the kind of offshoring which is not in fact offshore, but if you want a kind of legalistic, juridical offshoring rather than a material or territorial offshoring. What's striking, almost like in diametric opposition, but somehow exactly equal, is the way in which Marianne is using the diamond, which is like the symbol of traditional material wealth, as a site of resistance to modern financial capitalization. So this kind of weird flipping around in what was traditionally the kind of material object of wealth, diamond, becomes the refusal of financialization, and what was the kind of let's call it the demonstration of not reporting wealth becomes the demonstration of how to maintain wealth without, how to put it, how to maintain wealth of one's own without it being publicly responsible. That's this kind of weird inversion of ownership and property. And that's it. That's my point.
Do you have a question for anyone?
No, I'd just like to hear,
Okay.
I guess, the response. I mean, I
Specifically, or just generally?
just
Okay.
generally. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to open it up to all of you, but I was wondering whether Angus would be open to addressing Suhail's
Well,
question.
should I formulate it as a question?
Well, I think that would be easier for someone to parse through.
Okay,
That's
all right.
why.
Let me formulate this as a question. Okay. So that,
Because I mean that's a great summary for everyone to sort of take stock.
well, it's okay. I mean, it's full of faults because I'm
Yeah.
just sort of
Yeah.
thinking it now. I guess the question would be, if you could describe, if you could identify the transformations in the relationship of visualization and abstraction, I guess, in relationship to capitalization.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of your presentation, where you hold this, what you think the salient features are of the relationship between capitalization, visualization, and abstraction.
All right. I mean that's pretty heavy. So I actually have an add-on to that
Sure.
specifically for Angus, but I wanted to see if anyone wanted to eat into that meaty question first. I realized that I don't want to unmute all of you at one go, so if you could just do a quick wave if you really want to take on the question first. All right. Angus and Nick. Okay. Nick, do you mind if we start with Angus first? Just because I just want to add on one of the things that I had wanted to ask. Angus, I'm going to put you up. All right. I am unmuting you, but I can't seem to. You might have to unmute yourself on your end. Perfect. All right.
Is that
Yes.
me unmuted? Yeah.
Yes. Now we can hear you. I just wanted to add on because I was actually curious about how the project with Headless has perhaps developed or over the number of years and how much it has been reactive to maybe the changes within Offshore. I thought it was particularly interesting with what Nathan was saying about the sort of new world order for Offshore, and I'm wondering how much the alternative reality that Headless or alternative system that Headless sort of provides is responsive to that, or where the changes or developments or growth of, let's say, the system that Headless puts out comes from, whether it's rooted internally or rooted maybe in response to the offshore system. So that's just an add-on to Suhail's question, which I feel, I think it's easily part of it. So just handing over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm probably not going to answer either of those particularly effectively because it would take me all day to answer one of them. Very briefly, with respect, I'll take the second one first in terms of how Headless has responded to changes in Offshore. It hasn't. And that's because it's not really, its primary function is not to explore in any kind of factual sense what Offshore is now or will be tomorrow. That's really not the point. It's much more about the practice of what we have come to call offshoring and its relationship with art practice and so on. So it's at a different level of abstraction from that, I think. So its primary interest, or it clearly has an interest in Offshore, is perhaps more about money, financialization, aestheticization and so on. So just as it hasn't felt the need to create a direct analog for offshore, nor does it feel the need to respond to changes in offshore itself. With respect to the sort of changes in abstraction and materiality and all these kinds of things, one way of summing up, offshore is simply one instance, a historical instance of practices that are very, very old. They're not new at all. It was interesting that Marianne brought up Venice and the Venice Biennale and all that kind of stuff, because Venice has a very particular position in all this. Partly because Venice is where double entry bookkeeping came from back in 1480, Luca Pacioli, and was one of the first really important visualizations of money that allowed capitalism as we now know it to take form. And so Venice has been absolutely crucial in the aestheticization of money as account, as technique. But there's another little story about Venice which seems to speak to some of this in terms of an older form of offshoreization. The word casino was into being because of the attempts of Italian nobles to get around a prohibition by the Venetian government on gambling. What was happening was that English tourists taking the Grand Tour would end up in Venice and would corrupt everybody by having wild parties in the grand houses of Venice, and everyone would get very drunk and lose lots of money. So the Venetian authorities banned the use of houses for these parties, and what they did was they simply built a little house next door, the casino, and that's where they had parties. The point being that our capacity to displace legal jurisdiction, whether we do it through materiality or whether we do it through abstraction or whether we do it through legal fictions or whether we do it through renaming, redefining things, is not new. It's something that's absolutely constant, no, not constant, but continuous throughout Western European capitalist evolution. The process that Nathan describes, which is fascinating, I didn't really know much about FATCA, I've been looking it up as we've been speaking, will shut down certain aspects of offshore finance. It won't shut down the processes of offshoring that we call offshoring or displacement. Just to give an example, Nathan will know this better than I do, the concerted efforts by the FBI a few years ago to shut down the process of tax sheltering. Not tax havens, but tax shelters in the US, which were created by people simply redefining money as something other than money, particularly as various types of bonds. And once you redefine money as a particular kind of bond, you don't have to tax it anymore, and this created a shelter from taxation. And these were aggressively marketed by the big accountancy firms for many, many years. And eventually the FBI shut it down. But they didn't shut it down completely because various parts of this practice now continue, but they're just in a more regularized form. Probably that's what will happen to offshoreization. But there will be a further, inevitably, wave of abstraction, displacement, movement, because that's a continuous part of what capitalism is. The Promethean nature of money allows it, the wobbly, porous nature of our legal systems allows it, and you put those things together and the opportunities to create these things never go away. So there's a constant oscillation between all of these things as money evolves and as money economies evolve, which is a kind of sit on the fence answer, I suppose, but I don't have a better one, because that seems to me to some extent what Headless is trying to do. Headless is not making necessarily a negative comment about all this, though there is a critique implied. It's noticing that these techniques work, and it's reproducing them in a different form and laying them out and saying, well, let's look at this and let's think about this, I suppose. Maybe it's a bit more than that, but there you go. So that's a non-answer to very difficult questions.
Thanks, Angus. We're gonna Nick wanted to respond as well, so I'm gonna switch over to Nick right now. Nick, you might agree. You are perfect. All right, I just want to check if anyone wanted to respond to Nick or Angus at this point. Just give a wave, then I will try to unmute you. Otherwise, we actually have 2 questions for Nathan. Okay, then Nathan, I'm going to hand it over to you. And we have a question actually from Robin about Freeport. So I'm going to have her speak. Can I speak?
Oh, can you hear me from there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, everyone can hear her just fine, right? Nathan?
Nathan, can you hear me from where you are?
Nathan? Oh, I think
we might have lost.
Hold on. Nathan, can you hear us? Nathan? You know what? Okay. Do we have any questions in the room? In the room that maybe we can direct to anyone else while I get Nathan back online?
It's more actually commenting on it, just
Okay, yes, okay, we have a response to Nick. Probably you probably want to sit over here, just to make it clearer. Can everyone hear Natalia?
Hi. It's actually a response to what you just said about The Wire, which is actually really funny that you bring it up, and the way in which the series kind of lays out all of the levels of abstraction. But what I find really interesting about The Wire is actually that the key to that is through communication, no? Through the access to those mediums of communication, through like the wiretapping, and also the advancements of it. So I'm wondering if you could kind of speak to the communicative role of art and whether or not that has a place in how you see its role in being able to visualize, not just visualize, but to access such complexity. I don't know. Just something I thought of.
Nick, you're going to have to unmute yourself, just saying.
There we go. Should be better now. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. There is, the process of coming to understand from, say, the cops' perspective in the show, of coming to understand the networks, involves the use of all these different technologies to record and trace out the social networks. But it also involves, following the money, as Lester puts it, and, the sort of unknowingness of where you're going to end up when you start following the money. Can you still hear me? It looks like it's locked up. Okay, okay. Okay. But yeah, it's quite interesting in that regard, because there is a sort of imminent process of abstraction within the show to sort of come to understand it, the terms that are set out by the show itself. I don't know how art plays into that necessarily, but it is a sort of internal cognitive mapping of the show, which is, I think, quite interesting. And I guess in a certain way as well, relating it to the theme of offshore, onshore, there is, this arms race that develops over the course of the few seasons between drug dealers and the criminal activity and the cops, where, one tries to trace out the network to make visible one aspect according to one network, but the other is trying to escape that visibility and constantly, changing up its behaviors, changing up the patterns, changing the technologies, in order to make sure that it remains invisible as opposed to visible. And it's sort of, I mean, if you want to define the offshore as something which escapes jurisdiction and taxation, well, black market economy, a criminal economy, is a fairly good example of that as well. So I think the show could also be interestingly sort of read that way.
They don't need to see. Yeah. It's to kind of like, for action, no, which is kind of like a head in, like throw yourself through. And then the notion of like an active withdrawal in the other practice is a form of obscurity in a way, and then Mired is the form of resistance. And so it's just kind of more of a comment, but I guess I'm wondering really, and I don't know how to formulate it as a question, but I'm wondering kind of like, in considering these conditions, what are the new terms for withdrawal or for resistance? Is it that the real choice is to kind of go head in? Is there really a point to withdrawal when you're not really ever that obscure? So yeah, it's just a comment about the different forms in which you guys are addressing how to deal with those tensions.
I can make a quick comment about that. I mean, in general, I don't think withdrawal is a particularly good strategy for politics. I think withdrawal tends to be necessarily temporary, necessarily partial and local. And when you're talking about something like capitalism, it's quite content to live with these, minor communities living outside of it, and then suck the life out of everybody else. So I don't think withdrawal as a sort of general tactic works in any case.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Robin has just suggested. Marianne, do you want to respond to that question about the question of withdrawal and different tactics? Hold on. You need to unmute yourself, Marianne. There we go. Can you hear? Can you?
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are on. Yes, you are.
Well, with regards to the question of withdrawal or not withdrawal, I think that I agree with you. I don't think withdrawal in itself is any kind of constructive strategy. But of course, I guess if there is a huge request for something and then you withdraw it, you would produce some kind of effect. But that's not the case for me. So it's not something that I think is available to most artists these days. But I would also say that the conditions under which artists work in different places can be quite different. So that, I mean, I speak from a Scandinavian Norwegian point of view where there has been a politics for which art, since there is no, historically, there isn't really any strong counterpart for artists. We don't have a strong church, we don't have traditionally a strong upper class. There is no nobility in Norway, so there hasn't been historically any counterpart. So the state took on that part in the 70s. So that means also that art production is supposed to be politically seen as something for and coming from the people somehow. So that also means that you have a whole politics surrounding artists and art production, where the state goes in quite heavily and finances the whole thing. And then, of course, there is a possibility for art to mean something else than just the production of luxury items. And that's something that I feel is, well, I don't know how that sounds in other parts of the world, but here it feels like something really important to protect as far as possible. That something should be outside of this general logic where, so I guess when it comes to the question of abstraction, or I think that for me it has been a goal to kind of work as concretely as possible, to make things that are concretely, it's possible to have a concrete experience of my work, because I think for me the issue at stake is very much that of democracy. And as I said earlier, there is this feeling, I believe, even though you can say that the effects of capitalism are very visible to most people, that's true, but at the same time I think there is a very widespread feeling of this happening without ever being, I mean, nobody ever asked us, and this was not what we voted for, and how did that really happen? And that is, I think, because there is a certain kind of opacity in the language itself that is used to talk about these things. So for me, trying to work in a very concrete way it's also a political position. Even though then, I mean, you could also argue that, I mean, making Vima, which is extremely concrete, I'm not sure it really worked, because people, anyway, they found it abstract and difficult to relate to, and they hated it, and, you know, it caused an outcry, as I said. So I'm not sure, really. But I do find it very interesting to think in those terms of what kind of abstraction are we talking about then? Well, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Marianne. Suhail actually has a follow-up question on
well,
that.
it's more a response to that last
response.
one, and also maybe to take up something Nick was saying about what art, the role that art plays in relationship to contemporary capital, consequences of capital. So I think what I was hurriedly proposing earlier, might be worth recapping, was the question of what is capital, what do capital assets and capitalization look like, and the kind of sequence I put forward was sort of incomplete. So firstly, I was saying it looks, I mean, this kind of follows a historical sequence as well, from Fordism to post-Fordism to now. So firstly, it's the yacht, which is the material object, and the demonstration of wealth and so on, and the broken ship. And then secondly, it's the what is called the necessarily mediated representations of the processes of capital accumulation, which are not about production or material labor conditions, but about accumulation on the basis of derivatives and other abstract instruments. But what struck me was maybe that there's a third moment beyond those mediated representations, which came out of Nathan's discussion of offshoring, where actually what capital assets now look like, because of the changes in regulation to offshoring, is it looks like art, right? But it looks like art. But it looks like art. So art here is a kind of visualization, not of the repercussions of capitalism, which Nick just mentioned, but of capital accumulation and assets themselves, right? But not in the traditional form in which the artwork is bought for a certain amount of money, and then it kind of represents that amount of money as well as whatever the artwork is doing. But it's a form of it's a capital asset through the abstract process of offshore accumulation, because of its obscurity to tax havens, to tax authorities. So what's weird here is that the artwork is art. Okay, I guess the traditional model that we look at when we think about art and capitalization is that the artwork is the demonstration of capitalization because it costs so much money. So instead of the yacht, you'd have Gerhard Richter painting or whatever, something like that, which could sort of show the kind of the wealth of the owner or the buyer. But from Nathan's presentation, it now looks more like art is a way of demonstrating contemporary processes of capitalization and the regulation of capital accumulation, which is important for the reasons that Bill was talking about yesterday in the search for stable juridical conditions to maintain the ownership of wealth, because of its obscurity to tax authorities. Right? So art, capital now looks like art, not because of the visibility of art, but because of the invisibility to tax authorities. It's kind of it's an abstract invisibility, because of course you can show the Warhol in front of somebody's eyes, but that's not its obscurity to the tax authorities. So that I think that was the kind of change in the levels of abstraction, in a way, going from the field of visual abstraction, which should be the concern from modernism onwards, to a question like juridical determinations of the obscurity of the artwork, which can be as big and as pompous as you wish, all the better to like soak up the money. But what I'm interested in around that is two things. Firstly, that art doesn't just, and this is again to repeat what I said to Nick, art isn't then simply through its representations dealing with the ramifications or repercussions of capital accumulation and its concentration and sort of trying to mediate a way out of that, it itself is a demonstration of the abstract forms of capital accumulation now. But what I was going to ask Nathan, specifically and directly, was in response to comments and a column by Nouriel Roubini, after the last Davos conference, where he was calling at Davos itself for the regulation of the art markets. And a comment he made there, which I didn't really understand until the presentation today, was that the art markets, large and as effective as they are now, are actually at a very early stage. And what's going to be needed, and now I understand why they're at an early stage, because there's going to be a lot of money pushed towards art because of these transformations to the tax authorities and offshoring. But what he asks for is the regulation of the art markets. And I was wondering, and art as an asset as well. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that last appeal by Roubini.
Nathan, you're going to just have to unmute your mic. Right.
It should be on now.
Yes, you're fine now. Just a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So now we're taking the discussion one step further from the corruption of art by economic interests to art resembling currency or a financial instrument, just in the way that it is owned and in the way that it's exchanged. So, for example, I think the Warhol is a particularly good example, because what a security, the attributes of a security as an investment are certainty of value, because there are markets where there are the equivalent of tickers that on a second-by-second basis will tell you how much something is worth, and the liquidity, how quickly can you sell it. So in a financial market, a stock or a bond, the value of it has a very high degree of certainty, and it has a high degree of liquidity. You can sell it from one second to the next. How do you get close to that with a work of art? Well, you take an Andy Warhol painting of a can, and there's enough of them out there, and they get auctioned frequently. And I think that's how you get as close to having those attributes in the piece of art. And then then the piece of art, it's not the value of the piece of art on every level isn't corrupted by the fact that it's being treated as an investment. It goes beyond that. The artwork itself begins to have attributes that are indistinguishable from currency or from a finance. And that is going to be increasingly avenue whereby people try to skirt new reporting requirements that exist with respect to financial assets. And it's art is one of the types of personal property that lends itself to that. A case of very expensive French wine would be another example, because it shares those attributes of certainty of value, or a certain amount of certainty as to how much it's worth, and liquidity, the ability to sell it rather, somewhat quickly.
So do you see regulation on art as an asset class on the horizon, or is it desired good?
I think there's certainly going to be efforts to close what is a perceived loophole, which is the ability to continue to skirt the regulatory regimes that are in place with respect to assets held. And yes, that's one of the areas that is already receiving increasing attention. But closing offshore loophole for financial assets was an effort spanning decades, and it really only came to a head when the United States government basically got fed up and threw the entire muscle of the hegemony of the dollar behind a regulatory regime that the U.S. took it upon itself to impose on the world. So that's a pretty dramatic sequence of events, and I wouldn't bet on a similarly dramatic sequence of events imposing an effective way to track and control the movement of art. But I think it has been identified as a goal, and it's not just art. Like I said, it's any personal property that can be traded in that way. But certainly there will be attempts to try to rein that in going forward.
We have a question about, Nathan, we have another question for you about the free ports. Why don't you go ahead, Robin?
Yeah, Nathan, can you hear me from where I'm sitting?
Can you hear Robin, Nathan?
Yeah, I can. Just speak up a little bit, please.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to the free ports or the free port situation as a way of maybe holding luxury goods, which include art, and how you see that developing, if that does play a big role. Yeah, I guess that's it.
I just wanted to add on to that. Yeah, no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So there are. When you free port, that term gets used to describe various different things, and I think what you're referring to are, for example, in Singapore, there are basically warehouses that occupy spaces that have been declared free of. That's a different kind of tax. That's usually free of sales tax or import duties, and the warehouses have sprung up precisely for the reasons we're talking about, to serve as the equivalent of a bank or a brokerage account custodian, whereas historically people have opened brokerage accounts and bank accounts and held their financial assets offshore. As soon as the world got wind of the fact that that was coming to an end, you almost immediately saw an increase in the existence of these basic highly secure houses occupying zones that are tax-free when it comes to other taxes, import taxes, and it's precisely for that purpose, for people to treat those warehouses as they would a bank account or a custodial account for securities.
Okay. I had an extension question onto that, but given that we have 5 minutes, I'm just wondering if anyone else on the panel had any questions? Just to shoot up a hand or wave at the camera. All right, if not, so yeah. One of the things that I found really interesting with free ports and generally the use of offshore is sort of the competition between basically what you're talking about, the hegemony of the US dollar in terms of calling more into international regulation and transparency. But one of the things, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a specialist, I am curious about the competition between different jurisdictions in this, in the sense of how, I'll give you an example. Singapore recently opened in the mid 2000s, a free port. And it's sort of infrastructure towards the development of the Singapore art scene, and a huge sort of, it's almost like when they set up the free port, it was creating a bank system, as you would say, almost for the storage of art, and a large number of artworks were stored there. And it was almost a way that, in a sense, put Singapore on the international map that maybe its own other investments in its art scene didn't. And what I mean by the international map is, of course, the international art world. And so in terms from a policy perspective, almost using the sort of free zone as a way of mapping itself territorially as a cultural player is sort of a strategy. So what I'm curious about is maybe, and I'm not sure whether you can speak to this, but maybe the sort of competition between different nation states or different regions when it comes to the use of offshore. Whether you think there's a strategy there, and what the relationship to the U.S. is. I mean, I've read some things about how Delaware is sort of a major offshore site, and is sort of it's competition, obviously, to the Cayman Islands or the BVI. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about this sort of global competition when it comes to the offshore, because I'm personally curious about how that plays out to sort of the competition between regional markets or emerging markets in art, and I mean by extension what that means for practice. But I'm more interested in perhaps your opinion on what offshore means as a strategy for sort of competition between regions or nations in terms of.
So yeah, there's certainly competition when it comes to these sort of free ports that have deposit personal property holding. Competition centered around many of the same parameters that have always existed, so that a place like Switzerland just had an aura about it that spoke to the safety, the security, the stability, the rule of law within their own system, so that people had confidence that they could take their assets and put them in Switzerland, and they wouldn't be embezzled, and they wouldn't be stolen, and they would be there in underground vaults for eternity. And I think Singapore has deliberately fashioned itself into the Switzerland of the Far East, and deliberately cultivated that same aura of stability and rule of law, even if the rule of law is at the service of cheating the laws of other countries. Internally within, say, the Singapore free port, the same exact structure would be less effective in a jurisdiction that didn't have the reputation for stability and internal rule of law that Singapore has. And I think there would, to the extent that these free port warehouse type storages for art take off, you'll see that competition playing out.
Thank you, Nathan. That's actually a very interesting point, because I think that calls into question a lot of the questions, the friction that Marianne brings up with the idea of democracy in art, and almost what the offshore represents as sort of a post-democratic moment almost. I mean, one can talk about the political system in Singapore and what it means for that type of security. But we are running out of time, and I just want, if you don't mind giving us 5 more minutes, we will have one more question in the room. Nathan, Robin?
No, Robin.
No, I don't actually have sleep.
Okay.
Sorry, give us 2 seconds. We have one last question in the room. And who is this directed to?
It's directed to Angus and Marianne.
Okay. This question is going to be directed to Angus and Marianne, so I'm going to put Angus up and then Marianne after, if that's okay. Thank you, Nathan.
Hi. I just want to pursue this issue of juridical obscurity as the way in which art plays a role in capital accumulation now, as a form of, I guess, embodied offshoring, if you want to call it that, or sort of materialized offshoring. And I was wondering to Angus and to Marianne, because you're involved, and Marianne, you're an artist, Angus, you're involved in an art project, and both of you make kind of critical claims, I think make critical claims for the artwork in relationship to capital forms. But if you do accept some sort of complication in the notion of the artwork as a mode of, as a kind of mode of capital development through its juridical obscurity, what I was wondering about was that, and Bataille is a key figure in this, I think, in which the kind of critical claims of art are made on the basis of its juridical obscurity, or its kind of its refusal of being a juridically agent, right? So art, through its autonomy, or it's kind of through its social licenses, isn't responsible to juridical authorities in the same way that other forms of social speech are. And freedom of expression is often called up as a key element of this license that it has. So there seems to be something within the conditions for art to be kind of critical activity, to kind of have the political and to make the kind of political and cultural claims that it does, which seems to somehow correspond very exactly with the way in which now it's being turned to as a form of private property to kind of do onshore offshoring, if you want. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about what this would mean for this kind of standard claims for the artwork as doing critical work.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. In one sense, it's unanswerable because the sort of the boundary between the autonomous artwork and the juridically regulated industry of which it then becomes a part is a very peculiar one. And it's definitely one of the boundaries that Headless plays with, but other Golden Centipede projects do too. There was a particular example a couple of years ago where they and Maria Lind had a contemporary art sale in Bukowski's art gallery in Stockholm, or Bukowski's auction house, which upset just about everybody and was designed to do so because what it did was reveal all sorts of layered structures of ownership and participation by all sorts of different economic actors and juridical actors in the art markets. And they placed pretty much unsaleable, uncommodifiable objects in that sale precisely to poke at these boundaries, to highlight the boundaries and to try and emphasize them. I don't think it resolved any of it, because I don't think it can be resolved in any complete sense. I mean, the art has always struggled with commodification because artists often see their work as, transcending commodification, whereas the market happily commodifies anything that they can do. Even the most obscure and most abstracted artwork seems to manage to find a commodified form eventually somewhere. So I think the resistance to commodification is both a necessary one, but also almost an impossible one. And the relationship between art and money and commodification is one that's been explored many, many times. I was thinking earlier, but when we were talking about these issues, about the work Joseph Beuys used to do in the 70s and 80s. Beuys had this ambition that art would have the same currency as money. Not because he wanted art to become money, he wanted it to have the same currency, to be universally ubiquitous. And he used to sit on the steps of banks and write onto banknotes, Kunst ist Kapital, art is capital. And in doing so, he made an ironic statement about the value of money, because he would both destroy the note by scrawling on it, but also massively increase its price by turning it into an artwork signed by Joseph Beuys. And these things still circulate, as do his blackboards, his lectures on money and all the rest of it. So I don't think any of the issues we're raising here are necessarily new. I think the boundaries are shifting. Because they do, and I think the stuff they've been talking about, and these bonded warehouses full of artworks are a different manifestation of an old problem, and I'm not sure it can be reconciled. I'm not sure there is some kind of purity for art to find. I'm not sure there is necessarily a kind of clean activism that art can engage in that somehow is not complicit in these markets anywhere. So I mean, again, I don't think I can answer the question in any absolute sense. Where would we go? I mean, I think we're looking at evolving mutually constitutive markets and practices that don't resolve neatly ever to anything, and I don't think they ever will. Which may be pessimistic, or it may be realistic, or cynical. But I can't see a clean or clear way forward, and I'm not sure that's art's role. I mean, not that art has a single role, but I mean, certainly my experience of working with Headless has been that we haven't sought those kind of clean resolutions. We've tried to play around with, engage with, and work with, and alongside and outside of various structures, including those of industry and including those of finance and art. And I don't think we've resolved them. That wasn't the aim. So anyway, I'll stop ranting and let Marianne have a go.
Okay, just because we have gone past the 5-minute mark, if any of you need to leave, I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving us your time today, and this has been a really rich discussion. We're going to continue with Marianne at this moment, but if any point that you need to leave, we understand that we've taken a lot of your time already of the day. So over to Marianne.
My own?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with you. I don't think there is any, I mean, this is one of the core issues as I see it, of how does art work? What is the artwork's function? And since, I mean, we cannot make the assumption that the artwork can be defined as one thing, that there is one definition covering all art production and all kinds of art objects. So I think this is something that is just, we're just going to have to stay in that as a kind of ongoing process, that's something that you study as you go along, more or less, the balance between, of course, I do sympathize in some way with the need for a regulation of the artwork on a luxury market. I do see that. But on the other hand, I also see the very negative impact that would have on, I mean, my possibilities as an artist and all artists' possibilities of working freely and experiment. So it's a very tricky, very tricky question, but I think it's one that is worth accepting as a kind of mode for art in which to just keep working with it. Because it's also always going to shift, it's always going to change. So as soon as, I can't remember who said this, maybe it was you, Angus, but as soon as you have a law, you also have the exception. And that's also going to apply to the art field. It's exactly the same thing as you have with the definition of art. It always changes. So I think it's just not something that is maybe very fruitful to look at as something that can be definitely solved. Although, of course, I do see the issue with the Warhol. Of course, it's I don't know. I don't have an answer. But I very much feel like, you know, advocating the possibility for something to not be compatible with this one big, strong. I mean, this logic that dominates everything, because it's just not sufficient. I don't think it comes close to being able to describe the human experience, and that's where I think art has a role. So yeah, that's it.
I actually think that's a wonderful way to end in terms of calling for such an end of hegemony of thought. And it's something that I think that thinking through the offshore and perhaps the changes in my ability and narratives around obscurity or transparency and the stakes of it on how it affects the art object as asset, or even art object as asset, and then that influence upon practice is something that needs definitely more thought, more discussion, and more research, which is something that Robin and I hope to do. I'd like to thank all of you individually again. This was a really rich and fantastic conversation that we've had, and I think that this opens up actually a lot of routes for smaller discussions and more intensive discussions. And it was interesting that, in a sense, we moved away from just the question of offshore to more fundamental questions about art and capital. So thank you again for giving us your time. We really do appreciate it. And for the people online, please stay tuned. All right. Thank you. Everyone have a good day. Bye.